At this very moment, you're inhaling and exhaling without any conscious effort, your lungs drawing in oxygen from the atmosphere, and your bloodstream delivering it to each and every cell. It happens automatically, without struggle, the most fundamental act of life. Yet try to picture waking up one morning to find the air had changed, not vanished, but altered in a way that makes it feel wrong. Thinner, more difficult to drag into your chest, each breath wearing you down a little more than before. That very scenario unfolded on our planet 252 million years ago, but it didn't last a day or even a week. It stretched on for tens of thousands of years, and during that time, nearly all life perished. If you're listening to this to drift off to sleep, that's wonderful. It's exactly why I create these episodes. So perhaps you'd consider subscribing and sharing where you are and what time it is right now. I love reading comments and discovering Tokyo in the early morning, Texas at midnight, or London during lunchtime. We're all scattered across this globe, breathing calmly, while I recount an era when breathing was far from easy. Imagine Siberia, 252 million years ago, but not the icy, barren landscape you might picture. This was before the ice sheets, before the frozen tundra. At that time, Siberia lay close to the equator and spanned an area bigger than the whole of Europe. The ground is tearing open, not in isolated spots, but across a vast expanse, thousands of volcanic gashes ripping through the terrain as though the planet itself is unzipping. Lava doesn't merely flow, it floods, molten rock pouring out in relentless sheets. Each flow is deep enough to cover a skyscraper, accumulating layer upon layer, building plateaus of hardened magma that would eventually reach 2 miles thick in certain regions. This was not a single volcano. This was the Earth bleeding profusely. Geologists now call it the Siberian Traps, where traps comes from the Swedish word for stairs because the weathered lava flows resemble enormous stone steps. But that clinical name doesn't convey the true horror of what unfolded. This was the most colossal volcanic event in the known history of our planet. The eruptions continued for somewhere between 60,000 and 200,000 years. Just think about that. Modern human civilization has existed for only about 10,000 years. The Siberian Traps may have erupted for 20 times longer than humans have lived in cities, and while they raged, the world perished. 96% of all marine species vanished. 70% of land vertebrates disappeared. Insects, which had survived every prior extinction, were devastated the first and only time in their history. This was not merely a mass extinction. It was the closest Earth has ever come to being completely sterilized. It was the event that nearly pushed the reset button on all complex life. Scientists call it the Permian-Triassic extinction event. But among themselves, they use a different name, the Great Dying, because that's exactly what it was, the greatest loss of life in Earth's history. Now, you might think, okay, massive volcanoes. Obviously, that's terrible. Lava kills things. Ash blocks the sun. We've all seen disaster movies. But here's what makes the Permian extinction so horrifying and so absolute in its destruction. The volcanoes were just the beginning. They were the spark that ignited a fuse connected to a dozen different bombs positioned across the Earth's systems. Each explosion triggered the next in a cascade of catastrophes that fed upon itself for millennia. The volcanoes pumped enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, enough to raise global temperatures by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. That's 18 to 27 degrees Fahrenheit. Picture every summer heat wave you've ever endured, then add another 20 degrees on top of it. Now imagine that becomes the new normal forever, or at least for the next 100,000 years. But CO2 wasn't the worst part. The eruptions also released sulfur dioxide, which combined with water vapor to create sulfuric acid rain. Not metaphorical acid rain, actual acid. Rain that could burn skin, dissolve limestone, and turn the oceans increasingly acidic. The same oceans where 96% of species were about to die. And then there was the methane trapped in frozen deposits on the ocean floor and in Arctic permafrost, massive reserves of methane hydrates. Methane is a greenhouse gas about 80 times more potent than CO2 over short timescales. As the planet warmed from volcanic CO2, it reached a tipping point. The methane deposits began to destabilize. Billions of tons of methane bubbled up from the ocean floor and burst out of thawing permafrost. This triggered more warming, which released more methane, which triggered more warming, a feedback loop scientists call a runaway greenhouse effect, the kind of thing that doesn't stop on its own. The warming oceans couldn't hold as much oxygen. Warmer water holds less dissolved gas. That's simply chemistry. So oxygen levels in the ocean began to drop, not everywhere at once, but starting in the deep ocean and spreading upward. Dead zones formed, expanded, and merged vast regions of ocean where nothing could breathe. On land, heat and drought devastated forests. When forests die, they stop absorbing CO2. Some of them burned, releasing even more carbon into the atmosphere. The ash and soot from burning continents darkened the skies, but not enough to cool things down, not enough to stop what was coming. And through all of this, over tens of thousands of years, life just kept dying. After dominating the planet for eons, many species simply found themselves with no way forward. Take the trilobites, for instance, those armored sea creatures that had roamed the ocean floors for 270 million years, enduring several earlier mass extinctions. But now they vanished completely. As for the synapsids, often referred to as mammal-like reptiles, and the ruling land animals, almost all of them perished. Just a very small number managed to carry on. Coral reefs that had formed over millions of years started to break apart in the increasingly acidic seas. The forests grew quiet as insects perished. The skies became barren as flying animals choked in the thin, scorching atmosphere. Imagine standing on a shore 252 million years ago, witnessing the sun come up over an ocean that was slowly dying. You'd have observed a planet turned into a strange, unfamiliar place. The seawater was dense with algae, but not the type that fosters life. Nutrients carried from the desolate land masses fueled poisonous algal blooms. The air was hazy from the heat, hard to inhale, and reeked of sulfur. What might have struck you most was the overwhelming silence. No birds were present, they hadn't evolved yet. Not a single insect buzzed. There was no ripple of life in the shallow waters. All that could be heard was the sloshing of toxic water on deserted beaches. That's the tale of this disaster. It began, it expanded, it destroyed, and most incredibly, life managed to drag itself back from the brink of complete annihilation. This narrative is inscribed in stone and ancient remains, painstakingly deciphered by researchers across many years. It happened so long ago that whole mountain chains have been formed and worn down in the meantime. Yet it's a tale that's still relevant at this very moment, as you relax in the darkness, breathing calmly. The forces that almost destroyed our planet 252 million years ago, volcanic carbon dioxide, rising sea temperatures, and self-reinforcing cycles, haven't disappeared. They aren't safely confined to the distant past. They're merely dormant. And it's wise for us to learn what stirred them awake before. Back then, 252 million years ago, Earth was unlike anything you can picture. Not because it was strange or empty or unwelcoming, but because it was so unbelievably teeming with life that the Earth appeared to breathe like a single unified being. The continents were not separated as they are now. Instead, they were compacted into one enormous landmass, which scientists refer to as Pangea. Every piece of land on Earth was squeezed into a single supercontinent running from one pole to the other. This gave rise to a world of extremes. Picture yourself at Pangea's heart, in a region that would later become Central Asia. In every direction, you are thousands of miles away from the closest sea. The core of this supercontinent held the most extensive desert ever seen on Earth. Daytime and nighttime temperatures could differ by as much as 50 degrees. For months, there wasn't a single rainfall. Powerful gusts howled across barren landscapes, unchecked by any obstacle. The environment was harsh, relentless, and nearly devoid of life for most of the year. However, eventually, the monsoon season began. These periodic downpours were triggered by the temperature contrast between the huge inland area and the nearby oceans. As soon as the monsoons hit, the desert changed completely in a single night. Short-lived lakes emerged, inhabited by fish and amphibians that had miraculously endured the arid months hidden in the mud. Plants burst forth from seeds that lay dormant. The scenery turned lush and green for a few valuable months until the water dried up once more and the pattern started over. This region was the core of Pangaea Extreme, governed by seasons and unforgiving. However, near its borders by the shorelines, it was a paradise, particularly during the late Permian period. These coastal areas hosted some of the most fertile ecosystems our planet has ever known. Warm, shallow waters, rich in nutrients, with river, deltas transported sediment and organic material from the interior of the continent. Forests were so thick that they generated their own climate patterns, and life was present everywhere. There were more species, more living matter, and greater ecological intricacy than the Earth had ever sustained previously. The woodlands were very different from today's forests. Flowering plants had not yet evolved. There were no grasses, no roses, no oak trees. Rather, the landscape was ruled by seed ferns. Despite their name, these were not genuine ferns. They belonged to a completely distinct category of flora that developed the ability to propagate via seeds instead of spores. These enormous trees, with fern-like foliage, could grow up to 100 feet high, forming thick overhead layers that kept most sunlight from reaching the ground. Among the seed ferns stood clusters of conifers, ancient cousins of today's pines and spruces, but well suited to the warm, moist conditions of the Permian shoreline. And throughout the undergrowth, and at the fringes of the woods, ginkgo trees flourished. That fundamental tree blueprint persists even now, a genuine living fossil that silently observed the emergence and extinction of innumerable other creatures across the next 250 million years. Beneath the canopy, the ground lay deep under layers of dead leaves, rotting branches, and the remains of tiny creatures. This organic debris nourished a complete community of organisms that break down matter. Ancient beetles had developed the ability to decompose resilient vegetation. There were also centipedes and millipedes, with some reaching the length of a human forearm, alongside primitive cockroaches that scurried across the layer of dead leaves. Fungi, mushrooms, molds, and tiny decomposers worked to convert lifeless material back into nourishment for the trees. Yet the true marvels of these woodlands were not the flora, but the fauna. If you had strolled through a forest in the late Permian, you would have met beings that feel more like products of a strange dream than genuine evolutionary creations. Consider these dinosaurs, enormous plant-eating therapsids, early proto-mammals that had split away from the reptile branch many tens of millions of years before. Several species measured 6 feet at the shoulder and tipped the scales at more than a ton. Their frames boasted broad, barrel-shaped chests, legs as thick as tree trunks, and heads that appeared bizarrely large compared to the rest of their body. These were the giant plant-eaters of their era, ambling gently through the lower layers of the forest, peeling away tree bark and yanking down limbs to get at tender leaves. Their mouths contained teeth, built to handle coarse plant matter rows of flat-grinding molars capable of pulverizing even the stringiest vegetation. As you might guess, they required those teeth because they were perpetually feeding to sustain their massive bodies. Still, these early dinosaurs were not the oddest inhabitants of the woodlands. That distinction fell to the dimetrodons and their kin. Imagine a reptile roughly the size of a big canine, yet featuring a sail on its back. This was no swimming fin, but a true sail. A delicate skin membrane spanned between tall spinal bones that could rise 2 feet high. The visual effect was as though a surfboard had been attached to a lizard. Researchers believe these sails functioned as heat-regulating tools, akin to living solar panels. They could soak up warmth during the early hours to speed up warming, or shed heat in the afternoon to avoid getting too hot. This trait offered sail-backed creatures a significant edge in the Permian environment, where temperatures swung wildly. This allowed them to become active earlier than their rivals, granting additional time for hunting or gathering food, and they certainly made good use of that time. While they looked peculiar, dimetrodons and their kind were top predators. They boasted large skulls housing teeth that were not uniform, unlike the simple rows of fangs in typical reptiles. Instead, their teeth were specialized for varied tasks. At the front were slicing teeth, on the sides there were penetrating canines, and at the back came cutting teeth for shearing. This arrangement represented a primitive form of the dental setup seen in mammals, rendering them remarkably efficient predators. They prowled the forest margins, pursuing plant-eating therapsids as well as the many small vertebrates that darted among the understory plants. Their method of hunting likely mirrored that of today's crocodiles, a sluggish, patient approach, capped by a swift, violent assault. As soon as those jaws fastened onto their target, the varied teeth made it nearly impossible for the victim to break free. Yet as the late Permian drew on, the reign of the sail-backed creatures was coming to a close. They were gradually supplanted by an even more extraordinary group, the true therapsids, the immediate forerunners of mammals. These were not mere primitive reptiles possessing a few mammalian traits. They were practically mammals in every respect except name. The most dominant among them were the gorgonopsians, predators that varied in size from that of a large dog up to creatures equaling present-day lions. They had completely given up the sail-backed physique. Instead, they evolved alternative methods to control their body temperature. Some researchers suspect they might have possessed a primitive form of fur. This was not the complex pelage of contemporary mammals, but rather simple strands that offered warmth and aided in keeping their internal temperature steady. Their skeletons display progressively more mammalian characteristics. For instance, their legs were situated more directly beneath the torso rather than jutting out sideways as in reptiles. That arrangement enabled greater efficiency in locomotion. They were capable of moving faster and for extended stretches compared to their predecessors. Certain species could likely maintain a trotting gait for hours on end, a feat no modern reptile can accomplish. Even more striking were their skulls. Large openings behind the eye sockets provided space for robust jaw muscles, and their teeth were accurately specialized for both killing and consuming prey. And most astonishingly, there is evidence that they had whiskers. Small indentations in the nasal bones indicate where nerve endings would have nourished sensitive whiskers. That implies that gorgonopsians could hunt effectively even in dim light, relying on touch to locate prey. They reigned as the supreme predators of the late Permian. They pursued prey in riverine forests, as well as the desert fringes, where seasonal rains provided momentary richness, and they thrived remarkably. Whenever paleontologists uncover fossils from that epoch, gorgonopsian remains are ubiquitous. They branched into many dozens of species, each fine-tuned for a particular ecological role. However, they did not occupy the peak of the food web alone. Also inhabiting these woodlands alongside them were early reptiles destined to spawn a lineage quite distinct: the archosaurs, forebears of dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and present-day crocodiles. During the Permian, archosaurs remained modest in size and rather unspecialized. The majority were not larger than domestic cats. They dashed through the bushes, chasing insects and small animals, yet they already possessed traits that would ensure their descendants' triumph: enhanced respiratory systems, improved temperature control, and ever more advanced ways of moving. Certain early archosaurs were starting to try walking on 2 feet instead of 4, and that was a groundbreaking change. That freed the front limbs for other tasks and enabled swifter running. Those initial bipedal explorations would later give rise to theropod dinosaurs and, finally, birds. Yet, during the Permian, 2-legged archosaurs were merely one of many survival strategies. The truly dominant archosaurs of that era remained 4-legged creatures such as the prestosuchids. These hunters closely resembled present-day crocodiles, featuring elongated frames, splayed limbs, and strong jaws lined with cone-shaped teeth. They ruled the river habitats, catching fish and lying in wait for animals that approached for water, with the rivers overflowing with food. The late Permian featured some of the richest freshwater ecosystems ever seen on Earth, filled with fish of all dimensions and forms. Certain species had evolved armored scales so dense they resembled shells. Other creatures developed electric organs to find their way and catch prey in cloudy waters. The forebears of today's ray-finned fish were starting to diversify, trying out various body shapes and feeding methods. However, the most remarkable water hunters were not fish. They were amphibians. Enormous temnospondyls, which could grow up to 15 feet long, were nothing like the tiny salamander-like animals typically associated with amphibians. Instead, they resembled crocodilian hunters, boasting huge flat heads and jaws that clamped down with tremendous power. These creatures inhabited rivers, lakes, and marshes along the coast. They preyed on fish, small reptiles, and even baby dinosaurs that came too near the shoreline. Certain species remained permanently in the water, having transformed into wholly aquatic hunters. Others were capable of traveling on land when required, dragging their heavy frames out of the water in dry periods to search for fresh ponds and streams. The coastline itself was where land and water ecosystems converged in a remarkable area of abundance. Mangrove-like woods sprouted right in the tidal zones, and mudflats were filled with burrows and footprints. River mouths, where nutrients from the interior flowed into the shallow oceans. And past the coast, the seas teemed with more life than ever previously. The Permian seas were founded on reefs, not quite coral reefs. The majority of reef construction was carried out by creatures that are now extinct. Rugose corals, tabulate corals, and peculiar reef-forming algae that could excrete calcium carbonate to build enormous stone-like formations. Those reefs extended for hundreds of miles across the warm, shallow tropical waters. These served as barriers, homes, and nurseries for an endless variety of sea life. Fish swimming among the reefs were completely different from modern species. The placoderms had vanished, long extinct by this era, yet their offspring had spread into every conceivable ecological niche. Cartilaginous fish, relatives of today's sharks, but with strange body shapes. Some possessed grinding teeth set in patterns meant for crushing shelled creatures. Others featured long, saw-like snouts for digging through the seabed. The bony fish were even more varied. Early ray-finned species had bodies that sparkled with metallic-looking scales. Lobe-finned fish employed their strong fins to patrol the ocean floor, and everywhere, tiny fish gathered into enormous shoals, silvery masses that shifted in unison, hoping to baffle hunters. Yet the most famous inhabitants of the Permian seas were not fish. They were arthropods, the trilobites. By the late Permian, trilobites had existed for nearly 300 million years. They had endured the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, and Carboniferous periods. They had withstood several mass die-offs and environmental upheavals. They were the ultimate survivors. A tale of triumph inscribed in their remains on every continent. Yet their numbers were dwindling. The Permian trilobites displayed less variety than their forebears, and shifts in climate plus rivalry from other arthropods had diminished them to a shadow of their past splendor. In the late Permian, merely a handful of families lingered. Specialized kinds occupied particular habitats that other animals couldn't use as efficiently. Nonetheless, wherever they were found, they flourished in great numbers. Certain types tunneled into muddy seabeds, leaving behind complex track marks while foraging. Others made their homes among the reefs, employing their jointed bodies to slip into gaps where hunters couldn't pursue. A handful had turned into plankton, drifting in the open sea and straining tiny organisms from the water. These creatures had no clue they existed during the late Permian. In the fading light of their era, they shared the reefs and open seas with beings that appear utterly bizarre to us today. Sea scorpions, also known as eurypterids. These were not genuine scorpions, albeit they were kin, and they were water-dwelling arthropods that had become among the most effective hunters the seas had ever known. Most Permian eurypterids were tinier than their predecessors. The huge versions that had haunted the Silurian seas had vanished. What survived were creatures that had become expert hunters. Certain species developed limbs shaped like paddles, perfect for gliding through water. Others, equipped with strong claws designed for snatching fish. All these hunters possessed compound eyes, allowing them to track swift prey in 3 dimensions. The seafloor was a living landscape. Sea lilies, crinoids resembling flowers, but truly, animals waved their feathery arms in the currents, capturing drifting food particles. Brachiopods, which resembled clams but were entirely unrelated, filtered water through their shells to feed. Ammonoids, cephalopods akin to modern nautiluses, had coiled shells that could grow several feet across. In essence, ammonoids were the cephalopod version of fish. These were swift, clever predators that employed jet propulsion to pursue their meals. They possessed sharp eyesight, versatile tentacles for grabbing, and could alter their skin color for camouflage. In numerous respects, they occupied the same positions in the ecosystem as modern squid and octopuses. Yet they carried their homes along with them, spiral shells with internal chambers they could fill with gas to adjust their buoyancy. All these elements, the forests, the rivers, the reefs, the open ocean, worked together as one interconnected system. This planetary ecosystem was more intricate than any that had come before, yet it was not completely stable. Even prior to the disaster, hints indicated that the Permian world was under strain. The climate had been slowly warming for millions of years, not with sudden catastrophe, but steadily. Inland deserts were spreading, and monsoon patterns grew more unpredictable. Areas that had been blanketed in forests for tens of millions of years started to become arid. Ocean chemistry was also changing. By studying Permian rocks, scientists have uncovered signs of slowly falling oxygen levels in certain marine habitats. This was not everywhere, nor severe, but enough to indicate that something fundamental was altering the way oceans circulated and mixed. Continental weathering patterns shifted as well. The immense Hercynian mountains, formed by the collision of continents that created Pangaea, were beginning to erode. This influx carried vast volumes of sediment and nutrients into the oceans. In the short run, this benefited marine life, more nutrients boosted productivity. However, it also caused more organic material to sink to the seafloor, where its decay would deplete dissolved oxygen. In some regions, the forests themselves started showing signs of strain. Fossil charcoal deposits from the late Permian reveal that wildfires were becoming more common. As the climate grew warmer and drier, fires occurred more often. Certain forest ecosystems were accustomed to fire. Numerous seed ferns and conifers possessed thick bark that could withstand occasional flames. But the fires were becoming too frequent for the plants to cope. Animal populations also exhibited signs of stress. A few fossil sites from the final million years of the Permian indicate a decline in diversity. This wasn't a mass extinction event, but rather a slow decrease in the variety of species. The most specialized creatures vanished first. Creatures that had evolved for very particular environments discovered that those environments were growing less stable. The Gorgonopsians remained in power, but they started encountering competition from an unforeseen quarter. Several therapsid lineages had taken a different evolutionary path. Rather than evolving into larger predators, these therapsids became small omnivores and insectivores. They were the cynodonts, the direct forebears of true mammals. In the Permian, they were minute. Most were no larger than rats. Yet they were incredibly adaptable, boasting a more efficient metabolism and more advanced parental care than any animals before. During stable times, the large predators ruled. But as conditions grew more variable, adaptability became more important than size or strength. The cynodonts were positioned just right. They were perfectly suited for a world in flux, not realizing that the rate of change was about to surge beyond anything evolution had equipped them for. In the oceans, comparable trends were appearing. The reef systems remained magnificent, yet their growth had modestly decelerated. Certain reef-building species were becoming less abundant. The shallow seas that once nurtured the reefs were transforming, growing warmer and a bit more acidic as atmospheric carbon dioxide rose slowly. To any imaginary observer, this change would have been imperceptible. The reefs appeared vibrant, the forests teemed with creatures, predators continued to hunt, and prey kept fleeing. The ancient cycle of life and death persisted as it had for countless millennia, yet the pressures were building up, much like a structure whose foundation gradually deteriorates. On the surface, everything seemed fine, but the hidden framework was growing more susceptible to any significant jolt, and that jolt was on its way. Far below what would one day be Siberia, magma was gathering in enormous reservoirs, pressure mounting. The global systems that had maintained Earth's stability for tens of millions of years were on the verge of a catastrophic collapse. The animals of the late Permian had no way of knowing. The Gorgonopsians stalking through the forests, the dinosaur-like reptiles grazing on seed ferns, the trilobites creeping along reef surfaces, the ammonoids hunting in the open ocean. None of them could detect the catastrophe brewing beneath their world. They existed during the final chapter of one of Earth's most triumphant periods, a time when life had spread across every corner of the planet, from the Arctic to the Antarctic. Ecosystems had achieved a level of intricacy never seen before, and the world felt more vibrant than at any other point. They were dwelling in a paradise, completely unaware that its end was imminent. The beginning took place in the region we now call Central Siberia. 252 million years in the past, the Earth started to tremble. But it wasn't the abrupt, forceful jolt of a seismic event. This was something else entirely. A profound and continuous vibration persisted for days, then weeks. Creatures that had survived many prior quakes could tell that something was off. They hurried away from the area, yet there was no escape that would make a difference. Far below the ground, a dire event was unfolding. An enormous column of scorching rock, hundreds of kilometers wide, was ascending from the divide between the planet's mantle and its core. This was no ordinary patch of magma. It was a thermal irregularity on a global scale. A pillar of liquid rock traveling upward through more than 2,900 kilometers of Earth's depths. It bore sufficient thermal energy to melt the continental crust overhead. Upon breaching the surface, the world cracked apart. However, this was not a volcano erupting in the familiar sense. There was no solitary peak exploding in a spectacular eruption. The event in Siberia was something infinitely more devastating. The Earth's crust split along enormous openings, some stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Out of these gaps, molten rock started to flow. There were no lava geysers blasting upward, no pyroclastic bursts hurling stone and cinders, only lava seeping from the earth, akin to blood escaping a wound. Streams of liquid stone, each a kilometer in breadth, creeping over the terrain at a pace like a leisurely stroll. They were relentless, unavoidable, devouring all that lay before them. Scientists refer to this as flood basalt volcanism, and its magnitude makes regular volcanic blasts seem like mere sparklers. An average eruption, even a disastrous event like Mount St. Helens or Krakatoa might eject only a few cubic kilometers of matter over a span of hours or days. Over the subsequent several 100,000 years, the Siberian Traps would discharge more than 4 million cubic kilometers of lava. Ponder that magnitude for a moment. 4 million cubic kilometers. That quantity of lava could submerge the whole of the continental United States beneath a 400-meter blanket. It could produce a flow spanning an expanse comparable to Europe. And it did not emerge in a single outburst. It arrived in surges, one wave of liquid stone after another. Each surge endured for thousands of years, with short lulls in between that could have given deceptive optimism before the next cycle of eruptions commenced. The earliest currents streamed across the Siberian terrain like water bursting from a fractured dam. The molten rock was basaltic, fairly runny in contrast to the viscous, eruptive magma that builds stratovolcanoes. This fluid nature was simultaneously a drawback and an advantage. It did not detonate violently. Thus, it refrained from instantly injecting massive volumes of ash into the upper atmosphere. Ash did not get thrown into the stratosphere, yet the flow could still travel far, and those initial streams surged over hundreds of kilometers, filling depressions, covering woodlands, and forming expansive flatlands of cooling stone that shone red for months, before eventually hardening into dark basalt. As the molten rock moved forward, it burned all living matter. Centuries-old trees caught fire, long before the lava reached them, set ablaze by the intense thermal radiation. Creatures too slow to escape were caught and sealed within solid rock. Whole ecosystems disappeared under layers of hardening stone within just a few days. Yet the direct devastation, for all its horror, was not the true cause of death. The real danger originated from beneath the surface. The magma, ascending through Siberia's crust, was not traveling through solid stone. During the Permian period, Siberia rested atop huge reserves of coal, salt, and limestone. These sedimentary layers, created from prehistoric oceans and woodlands, lay many kilometers below. The rising magma tore straight through these formations, raising their temperature to thousands of degrees. Whenever magma forces its way through coal, a frightening event takes place. Coal is basically compacted carbon. If you heat it sufficiently, it does not simply catch fire, it turns into gas, emitting vast amounts of carbon dioxide and, even more critically, methane. Vast coal reserves in Siberia held hundreds of gigatons of organic carbon, built up over countless millennia from Carboniferous-era forests. When magma intruded, it transformed those ancient coal beds into what became the planet's largest generator of gas. Methane started escaping from cracks across the entire area, not the gentle leaks we see from modern gas fields, but enormous eruptions of greenhouse gases on a scale Earth had never witnessed before. Over short periods, methane traps around 80 times more heat than carbon dioxide. The Siberian Traps kept releasing teratons of methane into the sky, but the salt deposits caused trouble too. When magma heats halite sodium chloride, it splits into sodium and chlorine compounds. Chlorine escapes as various gases, including hydrogen chloride and organochlorines, born from reactions with organic matter. Those chlorine compounds rose high into the atmosphere and proved devastating for Earth's ozone layer. Limestone added its own effect. Heated by magma, calcium carbonate breaks down into calcium oxide and CO2. More greenhouse gases came not just from lava, but from immense amounts of sedimentary rock being baked by intrusions. Each cubic kilometer of magma that moved through limestone produced additional megatons of carbon dioxide. The atmosphere was being bombarded from many directions, and the lava flows themselves released volcanic gases. Gigatons of sulfur dioxide poured out, bringing immediate consequences. Mixing with water vapor, it formed sulfuric acid aerosols that blocked sunlight and caused temporary cooling. Yet a volcanic winter was the smallest of Earth's worries. Then came carbon dioxide. Every volcanic system gives off CO2, but the Siberian Traps were operating on a scale never seen before. Both the lava degassed and the heat from intrusions through carbonate rock generated CO2 thermally. Heating organic deposits added even more. Within just the first few thousand years of eruptions, atmospheric CO2 levels rose from roughly 400 parts per million, similar to pre-industrial levels toward figures that would eventually surpass 2,000 parts per million. Yet methane acted as the true accelerant. Methane released from heated coal layers started building up in the atmosphere. Unlike CO2, which plants and natural weathering gradually remove, methane accumulates swiftly and triggers rapid warming. That rapid warming then sets off feedback loops. The eruptions came in bursts, not a steady flow, distinct episodes separated by hundreds or thousands of years. Each pulse could persist for millennia. New fissures would open. New lava flows would spread across already ruined landscapes. The volcanic system worked like a pressure valve that could never fully close. Between these pulses, life might have tried to bounce back. Plants could have begun reclaiming the edges of the lava fields, and animals might have returned to regions where the flows had cooled and weathered enough for vegetation. Then the next pulse would start, and the destruction would begin all over again. It's hard to picture just how much lava accumulated. Geologists studying the Siberian Traps today find basalt layers piled hundreds of meters thick in some places. Individual flows extend hundreds of kilometers. Eventually, the entire volume of lava covered roughly 2 million square kilometers, an area bigger than Alaska beneath flows that averaged over a kilometer deep. In some spots, the stacked basalt layers reached 3 kilometers thick. This wasn't just surface volcanism. Magma intrusions deep underground created huge sill complexes. Horizontal sheets of intrusive rock, hundreds of meters thick, spread through the sedimentary layers like enormous underground lakes of molten stone. These sills kept heating the surrounding rocks, still generating gases, and still adding to the atmospheric load even after surface flows had stopped. The immediate regional effects were like something out of a nightmare. Ash falls blanketed much of northern Pangaea. This wasn't the high atmosphere ash that causes volcanic winters that came from different mechanisms later, but local ash that buried landscapes under meters of gray powder. The ash was poisonous, packed with fluorine and other elements. It poisoned vegetation and water sources. Rivers got blocked by lava flows, creating huge temporary lakes that later burst through their dams in catastrophic floods. These flood events scoured the landscape, carrying volcanic debris thousands of kilometers from the source and spreading contamination across Pangaea's interior. What had once been part of Pangaea's northern forests became a hellish landscape, with smoking lava fields stretching to every horizon. The air was thick with volcanic gases that killed anything that tried to breathe. Near the active flows, temperatures were high enough to ignite spontaneous fires in any remaining vegetation. Ash and sulfur compounds darkened the sky, blocking the sun and creating a permanent twilight. Yet the true disaster wasn't only what was unfolding in Siberia, it was what started happening everywhere else. The gases pouring into the atmosphere didn't stay local. Prevailing winds carried them across the entire planet. Sulfur dioxide formed aerosol layers in the stratosphere, creating a thin veil that reflected incoming sunlight. In the first decades after eruptions began, global temperatures actually dropped. Volcanic winters settled over a planet that couldn't handle any additional climate stress. Plants that had flourished in the warm Permian climate were suddenly confronted by abrupt cold spells and less sunlight, making photosynthesis less efficient. Their growth slowed, and some species, especially those already at the edges of what they could endure, began to die off. This cooling didn't last long and was almost merciful compared to what lay ahead. Sulfur aerosols stay in the sky for only a few years before falling as acid rain, washing away and settling on the ground, so the cooling effect quickly fades. But the carbon dioxide and methane that built up alongside the sulfur, they endure. CO2 lingers in the atmosphere for centuries, while methane lasts decades before oxidizing and turning into even more CO2. So the short-term pattern was harsh. Cold snaps killed tropical life. Then rapid warming followed as greenhouse gases overcame the aerosol's cooling. Then another eruption pulse would inject fresh sulfur, creating yet another cold snap. The climate wasn't just heating up. It was swinging violently between extremes on timescales far too fast for evolution to keep pace. Meanwhile, the volcanoes released halogens, chlorine, and fluorine compounds that rose into the stratosphere and began destroying the ozone layer. Ozone depletion had never occurred on Earth before, and no natural process had ever produced it at such a scale. But the Siberian Traps were creating one, and as stratospheric ozone dropped, ultraviolet radiation at the surface started to increase. UVB radiation, the type most harmful to DNA and organic molecules, began reaching the ground in amounts life had never evolved to handle. Plants in direct sunlight were hit with mutagenic radiation, and animals with exposed skin developed burns and cancers. The most vulnerable were aquatic organisms in shallow, clear waters, where UV penetrates deepest. But this was only the beginning of the cascade. Each effect triggered more effects, and the warming from greenhouse gases started altering ocean circulation. UV radiation was damaging phytoplankton, the foundation of marine food webs, and acid rain from sulfur compounds was changing soil chemistry all across Pangaea. There was another mechanism at work too, one that wouldn't become clear for tens of thousands of years. That mechanism would turn out to be the final nail in the coffin for most Permian life. The warming was nearing a critical threshold. Ocean surface temperatures were climbing, and in the deep ocean within the sediments of continental shelves and abyssal plains, vast deposits lay hidden. These deposits were made of a strange substance called methane clathrate, or methane hydrate, methane trapped inside cages of ice molecules, stable only at low temperatures and high pressures. Over millions of years, bacteria break down organic matter, producing methane that gets locked into these frozen structures. Those frozen structures, Earth's oceans, contain trillions of tons of methane locked in clathrates. As the seas warmed from volcanic greenhouse gases, these deposits were approaching their stability limit. Once ocean temperatures rose past a certain point, the clathrates would begin to destabilize. The ice cages would melt, and all the trapped methane would escape into the water, bubble up to the surface, and enter the atmosphere. This is called the clathrate gun, a feedback loop where warming releases methane. Methane causes more warming, and more warming releases even more methane. Once triggered, it becomes self-sustaining until the deposits are exhausted, and the Siberian Traps were loading that gun. Every gigaton of CO2 and methane from the volcanic system was pushing ocean temperatures higher, inching closer to the trigger point. Once that threshold was crossed, the volcanism itself would become almost irrelevant. The planet would take over the job of killing itself, but we're not there yet. For now, maybe 10 or 20,000 years into the eruptions, the world was still just dealing with the direct volcanic effects. Deadly, yes. Catastrophic, absolutely. But survivable for most species if it had stopped there, which it wouldn't. The Siberian Traps would keep erupting for hundreds of thousands of years. Greenhouse gases would keep accumulating, and the climate would keep destabilizing. Eventually, Even the oceans themselves would turn against life. The eruptions spreading across Siberia were just the match being struck. The real fire was about to engulf an entire world. The Siberian Traps had opened Earth's crust like a wound. Lava kept pouring out, month after month, year after year. But the real killing had barely begun, because what happened next wasn't just volcanic eruptions. It was a cascade, a chain reaction of environmental catastrophes, where each disaster triggered the next. Each failure in Earth's systems amplified all the others until the entire planet was caught in a death spiral that would last for hundreds of thousands of years. The first thing that changed was the temperature, and it changed fast. In only a couple of thousand years, the planet's average temperature climbed by 8 to 10 degrees. That may not seem dramatic, but your room temperature likely fluctuates more than that in a single day. However, we are referring to the average temperature across the whole Earth, oceans, land masses, poles, and equator increasing all at once. Certain areas, especially the higher latitudes close to the poles, experienced even more rapid warming, 15 degrees Celsius in some places, possibly higher. For context, the temperature gap between an ice age and our current era is just about 5 degrees Celsius of global average increase. The Permian extinction witnessed twice that amount, occurring 50 times more quickly. This was not a slow climate shift that organisms could adjust to over thousands of years. It was geological chaos unfolding on such rapid timescales that evolution could not keep pace. Creatures, those that had evolved over millions of years to thrive within particular temperature zones, abruptly found themselves being baked in surroundings that had turned deadly hot. Vegetation, attuned to exact seasonal rhythms, saw their complete life cycles thrown into disarray when the cold that should herald winter never came. The polar areas of the north and south, once cool yet livable, shifted into humid subtropical climates. Ice sheets that had existed for eons vanished in the blink of a geological eye. The reflective ice that once bounced sunlight away was gone, giving way to dark seas and land masses that soaked up heat, pushing temperatures still higher. However, the rise in temperature alone was only the start. While carbon dioxide kept gushing into the air trillions upon trillions of tons over hundreds of millennia, another phenomenon began to occur. That gas started to dissolve into the seas. This is ordinarily a natural cycle. Seas routinely take in CO2 from the air. This is an element of Earth's carbon cycle, one of the processes that normally maintains climate balance across extended eras. However, the Siberian Traps were emitting carbon dioxide at levels far surpassing what the planet's natural mechanisms could manage. Upon dissolving in water, carbon dioxide turns into carbonic acid, a mild acid. It's the very compound that imparts a faint acidity to soda pop. Yet the seas of the late Permian were not merely acquiring a mild sourness. They were turning detectably more acidic, their pH sinking from the mildly alkaline state that had persisted for millions of years. This proved disastrous for any organism that constructed its body using calcium carbonate. Every organism, with a hard outer covering corals, bivalves, gastropods, tiny plankton with fragile calcareous shells, life forms that had thrived in Permian waters for hundreds of millions of years all at once, discovered their shells were disintegrating. Not figuratively, but actually breaking down in water that had grown too acidic to sustain calcium carbonate formations. Picture yourself as a coral, attempting to grow your structure while the surrounding water actively erodes everything you create. Envision being a young plankton that has just developed a fragile shell, only to have the ocean begin dissolving it quicker than you can mend it. The reefs were the first to fall, and those reefs were far more than just homes for corals. They constituted complete ecosystems, three-dimensional frameworks that offered refuge and foraging areas for countless other species. Once the reef-forming creatures perished, all those reliant on them also perished. Fishes, crustaceans, worms, algae, the entire complex food chains that had developed around reef formations over millions of years vanished in just a few thousand years. However, the destruction of reefs was merely the surface manifestation of a far more profound catastrophe. The actual massacre was unfolding within the water itself, on a molecular scale, as oxygen was vanishing. Typically, our planet's oceans are saturated with oxygen. The upper layers take it in from the air. Currents, propelled by contrasts in temperature and salt concentration, distribute that oxygen through the entire water column, transporting it to the abyss, where it sustains organisms even kilometers beneath the surface. Yet the Permian warming dismantled this system of circulation. This is how it unfolded. Ocean currents rely on variations in density. Water that is cold and saline is denser, it descends. Warm, fresh water is less dense, it remains above. That contrast generates flows, conveyor belts that shift water and oxygen across the globe. In the present-day Atlantic, frigid water develops close to Greenland, plunges downward, and travels southward along the seabed, later rising near Antarctica, delivering deep nutrients to the surface. This thermohaline, circulation, as researchers term it, acts as the very motor that powers ocean blending. The Permian warming shattered that motor. With rising temperatures, the density contrast between shallow and deep waters diminished. The cold descending water was no longer so cold. The currents slowed. Eventually, in numerous places, they ceased completely. The seas became stratified, splitting into discrete strata that ceased to intermix. Shallow waters remained on top, growing ever hotter. Deep waters lingered at the bottom, separated from the atmosphere's oxygen, gradually using up any leftover oxygen via bacterial metabolism and decomposition of organic matter. The deep oceans were the first to perish. Lacking any renewal of oxygen, the seabed waters of Permian seas turned anoxic, entirely void of dissolved oxygen. Organisms that lived on the bottom, trilobites, brachiopods, and primitive crinoids that had blanketed the ocean bed for hundreds of millions of years, suffocated. Their remains accumulated, forming dense strata of organic-laden sediment that paleontologists can still locate today, 252 million years afterward. These are known as black shales, the mark of lifeless, oxygen-starved seas. Yet anoxia did not remain confined to the depths. As circulation kept deteriorating, the dividing line between oxygen-rich shallow water and oxygen-depleted deep water started to ascend. Picture it as a tide. But rather than water moving upward, it is the lack of oxygen that slowly crept higher through the water column. Gradually and relentlessly, it annihilated all life as it ascended. The oxygen minimum zone, the layer separating oxygen-rich water from oxygen-free water, swelled from just a few hundred meters in thickness to thousands of meters. Ultimately, in numerous places, it climbed all the way to the surface. Coastal shallows, normally the most oxygen-filled and life-sustaining regions of the ocean, turned into lifeless areas where no creature could draw breath. And that is when the situation became utterly horrifying. For in waters devoid of oxygen, entirely different bacteria begin to dominate. These are not the typical bacteria that breathe oxygen as most living things do. Anaerobic bacteria, ancient life forms that developed billions of years ago, back when oxygen was scarce in Earth's atmosphere, utilize sulfate rather than oxygen for their metabolic processes. And the waste they produce is not the fairly benign carbon dioxide that oxygen-dependent creatures release. Instead, their waste is hydrogen sulfide, H2S, the identical chemical that lends rotten eggs their distinctive odor. In minuscule quantities, hydrogen sulfide is merely disagreeable. In large concentrations, it ranks among the most poisonous compounds on the planet. It attaches to the very cellular mechanisms that ordinarily handle oxygen, halting respiration on a molecular scale. Inhaling air containing as little as 1% hydrogen sulfide can be fatal within minutes. Your cells become utterly incapable of processing oxygen, even when oxygen is present. In the oxygen-starved depths of the Permian seas, sulfate-reducing bacteria proliferated explosively. They thrived on the constant shower of decaying organic material descending from the perishing surface waters. The amount of hydrogen sulfide they generated is almost unimaginable, not measured in parts per million or parts per thousand. At the height of the extinction, certain ocean waters likely contained several percent hydrogen sulfide by volume. That water was fundamentally toxic, and it was ascending. The deep water, rich in hydrogen sulfide and marginally denser than surface water, started to mix at the edges and expand upward and outward. Everywhere it reached, it killed fish that had already endured the warming and acidification. The sudden drop in oxygen meant they were now swimming in poisonous water that seared their gills and halted their metabolism. The scant surviving bottom feeders that had fled to shallower depths in search of oxygen discovered they were escaping a poisonous tide that pursued them up the continental shelves. Yet the hydrogen sulfide did not remain confined to the sea. At the boundary, where water meets air, H2S gas began to effervesce out of the liquid, bubbling up like venomous champagne and seeping into the atmosphere. Hydrogen sulfide is denser than air, so it tends to cling low to the ground, dispersing over low-lying regions and gathering in valleys and coastal plains. Land animals dwelling close to the shore abruptly discovered they were inhaling poisonous vapors. Not all the time, not every location, but in surges when air currents swept the gas landward, or when especially dense pockets rose from offshore lifeless zones. Creatures that had outlasted the heat and dryness now confronted a fresh danger, invisible, scentless at extreme concentrations where it numbs the sense of smell, and utterly deadly. However, the hydrogen sulfide also triggered another issue, one that would impact life far beyond the poisoned shorelines. When H2S ascends into the upper atmosphere, it engages with oxygen, and it does more than just react. It annihilates stratospheric ozone, O3, the molecule that creates a protective shield in the high atmosphere, safeguarding Earth's surface from the sun's ultraviolet rays. The ozone layer is one of those invisible essentials we never notice until it disappears. It is invisible, intangible, merely a slightly higher concentration of a particular oxygen isotope floating 20 to 30 kilometers above our heads. But it is absolutely critical for life. UVB and UVC radiation from the sun, the high-energy wavelengths that the ozone layer normally absorbs, are incredibly destructive to biological molecules. They shred DNA, break down proteins, and kill cells. Life on Earth only colonized land after the ozone layer formed hundreds of millions of years earlier. Before that, UV radiation made the surface essentially uninhabitable. Anything exposed to direct sunlight would have been sterilized by radiation. During the Permian extinction, that safeguard started to break down. As hydrogen sulfide ascended into the stratosphere, it accelerated the destruction of ozone molecules. This thinned the protective layer, not completely eradicating it, but diminishing it sufficiently that UV radiation at ground level rose sharply. Certain estimates indicate that UV intensity may have doubled or even tripled during the most severe stages of the extinction. For plants, this was disastrous. Terrestrial plants in the Permian were already suffering from heat and drought. Now they were being bombarded with radiation, their cells incurring damage faster than they could mend the DNA. Forest canopies that had endured for millions of years started to wither, not because of disease or herbivores, but due to sunburn. In essence, radiation harm built up more rapidly than growth could compensate. The fossil evidence from this era reveals a sudden increase in plant spores featuring thick protective walls. This is precisely what we would anticipate if plants were subjected to intense UV radiation. They are shielding their reproductive cells, enveloping them in additional layers of UV-blocking substances, aiming to guarantee that at least a few seeds or spores endure, even if the parent plants perish. However, it wasn't only plants that were afflicted by the UV radiation. Phytoplankton, the tiny algae that constitute the foundation of marine food chains, are especially susceptible to UV harm. They reside at the very ocean surface, where sunlight reaches, the exact place they require for photosynthesis. Under typical circumstances, the ozone layer provides them protection. But during the extinction, they were left exposed. Research on modern phytoplankton indicates that even small rises in UV radiation can cut their growth by 10 to 20%. In the Permian extinction, UV levels may have doubled, causing phytoplankton populations to plummet. When the foundation of the food chain crumbles, all that relies on it crumbles as well. The seas were perishing from the depths upward, lacking oxygen, and from the surface downward, tainted by hydrogen sulfide and scorched by UV rays. Yet another feedback loop remained, another escalating catastrophe poised to be set off. Methane. Typically, enormous quantities of methane lie locked in seafloor sediments, solidified into formations known as methane hydrates or clathrates. These are basically ice lattices that imprison methane molecules under high pressure in cold, deep ocean waters. The quantity is staggering, likely more carbon-bound in methane hydrates than in all the planet's coal, oil, and natural gas reserves put together. Methane hydrates remain stable only when pressure is high and temperature low, but they are fragile. Increase the temperature by just a few degrees, and they begin to decompose, freeing methane into the water. That is precisely what occurred during the Permian. As ocean temperatures climbed due to the initial CO2-linked warming, the deep waters heated up slowly initially, but recall that ocean circulation had halted. Heat built up rather than spreading out. In certain areas, the seafloor temperature increased sufficiently to disturb methane hydrates. They commenced releasing their trapped methane. Blisters of methane gas ascended through poisoned waters, breaking the surface and escaping into the air. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas, far more efficient at capturing heat than carbon dioxide. On brief time spans, one methane molecule in the air induces roughly 80 times the warming of a CO2 molecule. This triggered an uncontrollable cycle. Heat set methane free. Methane led to further warming, which in turn freed additional methane. The mechanism amplified itself, quickened, and veered beyond control. Some scientists believe that methane emissions in the Permian extinction might have been disastrous. Abrupt episodes where enormous amounts of hydrate decomposed almost instantly, producing plumes of methane that bubbled upward, forming brief areas where seawater actually frothed with leaking gas. These so-called methane burps would have supplied extra surges of heat, adding to the already dire temperature increase. Each surge eliminated species that had endured earlier catastrophes. Every pulse drove the climate deeper into conditions where life could barely operate. The rock layers from that era contain clear geological proof of large-scale methane release. Isotopic signatures of carbon in limestone and organic material reveal unique patterns. Abrupt changes in the proportion of carbon, 1,2 to carbon, 1,3, can only result from massive infusions of carbon, originating from methane. This occurred repeatedly throughout the extinction. Successive waves of methane emissions stretched across hundreds of millennia, and every wave aggravated the situation. The heating intensified. Ocean oxygen depletion grew more severe. Hydrogen sulfide generation increased. Ozone layer degradation worsened. Each collapse magnified the others, weaving a net of sequential catastrophes. No haven existed, no way out, no place on the planet that wasn't turning into a hostile realm for living things. Land animals confronted impossible decisions. They could remain by the shore, where moisture and plants were still present, but faced the danger of hydrogen sulfide fumes and contaminated water. Alternatively, they could move inland, where heat was more intense. Drought had converted woodlands into barren lands. Nourishment was limited, and UV rays were deadly. Ocean creatures had zero options. They dwelled in water, and that water was expiring. The oxygen needed by complex organisms was vanishing from the seas. This loss was not slow, nor confined to small areas that creatures could escape. It was happening worldwide. Anoxic areas expanded, and dead zones enlarged. The regions where a fish could respire, a trilobite could endure, or plankton could thrive, those areas diminished. Life became compressed into ever smaller refuges, isolated patches of barely survivable environments. The remainder of the earth scorched, suffocated, and poisoned itself. And the most terrible aspect, this was not fleeting, nor a short-lived disaster, after which recovery came. The Siberian Traps erupted over a span of 1 to 2 million years. The chain of ecological breakdowns they set off lasted hundreds of millennia, perhaps even more. Successive generations of creatures were born into a fading planet, fought to endure unlivable circumstances, and perished without witnessing any betterment. No rescue was arriving to rescue the Permian biosphere, and no abrupt restoration of normalcy occurred. Only ages upon ages of decline, where every generation encountered circumstances a bit harsher than those of its predecessors, where adjustment was futile because the world transformed more swiftly than evolution could keep pace. That was the chain of extinction. It wasn't a single factor wiping out all life, but rather every element turning against each other. All the natural systems that usually sustain life collapsed together, producing a mix of environmental pressures unlike anything any organism had ever faced, pressures that no species was equipped to survive, and a staggering 96% of them didn't. These creatures vanished, completely erased, devastated by extreme temperatures, acidity, lack of oxygen, toxins, radiation, or lack of food, sometimes multiple factors at once. Those who managed to survive were not necessarily the most powerful, intelligent, or numerous. They were simply fortunate species that coincidentally possessed exactly the necessary qualities to withstand precisely the right amount of the right pressures to endure. They were accidents of nature, unlikely survivors of the harshest environment our planet had seen in hundreds of millions of years. The seas had turned into a layered, oxygen-starved, poisonous horror. The air was thick with heat-trapping gases, toxic vapors, and unchecked radiation. The ground had become overly hot, extremely arid, and so irradiated that it could no longer sustain the vast forests that had dominated entire continents for eons. Our planet during the late Permian wasn't merely experiencing an extinction event. It was being reshaped, transitioning from a world that nurtured life into something like a gradual catastrophe. A realm where the usual conditions for survival were put on hold, where the processes that kept the air breathable, water clean, and climate steady all failed simultaneously. And that state would persist for an extremely extended period. The extinctions did not occur instantaneously. That's simply not how such events unfold. Even the most severe ones occur as a chain reaction. One ecosystem after another toppled like dominoes, each collapse setting off the next, until the entire global biosphere teetered on the brink of utter destruction. Let's begin with the oceans, since that's where the destruction was most intense, wiping out 96% of all marine species. Take a moment to consider that figure, not 96% of individual organisms, but 96% of distinct species. Every unique life form that evolution had shaped over hundreds of millions of years had vanished. If you had been able to stroll along the ocean floor at the peak of the crisis, you would have seen it blanketed with remains. Shells accumulated in layers, meters deep, reefs were smashed into debris, and the water lacked oxygen to the point that nothing bigger than bacteria could live. The trilobites were the first to go, or more accurately, the last to remain. These arthropods had been a triumphant tale of the ancient seas for 270 million years. They had endured two earlier mass die-offs. They had adjusted to every kind of marine habitat, from warm, shallow waters to the deepest ocean floors. They had branched into thousands of species, each representing a distinct strategy for thriving in Earth's primordial seas. By the onset of the Permian extinction, trilobites were already dwindling, down to only a few species barely surviving in narrow habitats. The last of them inhabited shallow coastal waters near the supercontinent Pangaea. These were tiny, unimpressive species in contrast to their magnificent predecessors. Yet they were survivors, having persisted through 270 million years of geological upheavals, climatic changes, and competition among species. But then, the seas started heating up and becoming more acidic, and even these final remnants couldn't adjust quickly enough. We have no way of knowing which specific trilobite was the very last to perish. Perhaps it was a lone creature creeping along the seabed when oxygen concentrations fell beneath the minimum needed to stay alive. Or maybe it was a whole colony suffocating in unison as water tainted with hydrogen sulfide flooded their environment. What is certain is that during the main phase of the extinction, the final trilobite perished. A 270 million year legacy of evolutionary triumph came to an end not with a dramatic event, but with a silent stop of life in toxic waters. The brachiopods, those lampshell organisms that had enriched the Permian oceans with their variety, faced an even harsher fate than the trilobites. More than 9/10 of brachiopod genera vanished, even though these creatures had ruled the seabed communities for hundreds of millions of years. They were filter feeders, able to prosper under conditions that would trouble most life forms. However, filter feeding depends on oxygen-rich water, and as the seas lost their oxygen, these animals died in large numbers from suffocation. Their shells gathered in huge death piles, strata of calcium carbonate that would later turn into limestone layers indicating the extinction horizon. The ammonoids, spiraled relatives of today's squid and octopus, came terrifyingly near complete annihilation, losing 97% of their variety. From hundreds of species occupying every ocean habitat, they were cut down to possibly only 2 or 3 evolutionary lines. They barely kept alive in scattered patches of tolerable water. These handful of survivors would later replenish the seas in the recovery era, but that was still millions of years in the future. At that point, they were so scarce that locating a partner would have been difficult. The reef ecosystems crumbled entirely. The Permian seas had been ruled by enormous reef structures. These reefs were constructed not by corals, they were present, but not yet the main reef architects, but by sponges, algae, bryozoans, and many other kinds of life that had figured out how to build shared frameworks. These reef systems were centers of biodiversity, hosting thousands of species within confined spaces. When the seas turned acidic, the organisms that built the reefs could no longer sustain their calcium carbonate skeletons. The water's chemistry had become their enemy, breaking down their shells and frameworks as quickly as they could form them. The reefs perished, and alongside them disappeared every creature that relied on them for sustenance and protection. Sea urchins, once widespread in Permian seas, were diminished to just one genus. Stalchinoderms, the starfish relatives that resemble flowers, had drifted in Permian seas for eons, but they lost more than 90% of their variety. Meanwhile, blastoids, a different type of stalked echinoderm, vanished entirely after 130 million years on Earth. The final blastoid perished in the midst of the primary extinction event. Yet the clearest sign of the ocean's dire condition was the breakdown of the entire feeding chain. It wasn't merely that single species disappeared. The complete organization of marine life crumbled. Normally, the ocean's living community forms a pyramid. Countless minuscule creatures make up the foundation, nourishing bigger animals step by step until top predators reign. When the Permian extinction concluded, this pyramid had flattened into a shape similar to a pancake. Only a handful of species managed to survive, and they stayed close to the very base of the food network. Not enough life remained to uphold intricate ecological structures. Proof of this can be found in what scientists refer to as body size shrinkage. Fossils dating from right after the extinction reveal that the survivors were much tinier than their earlier kin. This wasn't merely a curiosity of fossilization. It indicated that the environment no longer had enough energy to sustain big animals. In the impoverished seas following the extinction, only small creatures that reproduced quickly could endure. On the continents, death was a little less extreme, but just a little. Roughly 70% of land-dwelling vertebrate species vanished. That may appear better than the 96% ocean extinction number, but keep in mind that terrestrial habitats were far younger and had less variety than their marine counterparts. First to disappear were the large plant eaters. Creatures such as moschops, enormous proto-mammals that grazed on Permian plants, much like ancient cattle, were among them. They perished because the plants they relied upon withered away. In the absence of big herbivores, the predators that hunted them found their meals vanishing. The gorgonopsids, saber-toothed proto-mammal predators that once ruled Permian landscapes as top hunters died out entirely. Not a single species remained. The dicynodonts, tusked proto-mammals that had been remarkably varied and numerous, dwindled down to only a few genera. From dozens of species that inhabited all kinds of land environments, from wetlands to dry plains, they shrank into tiny groups, representing just a couple of surviving lines. One survivor, the genus Lystrosaurus, would later play a huge role in the revival era. Yet during the extinction event itself, even this hardy genus nearly vanished forever. These creatures had developed advanced traits, such as varied teeth, an upright stance, and perhaps even fur and warm-bloodedness. They were following an evolutionary path that would someday give rise to true mammals, but the extinction almost brought that narrative to a premature close. The parasaurs' giant armored plant eaters that resembled a cross between turtles and rhinos died out completely. The captorhinids, an old lineage of reptiles that were among the first to venture onto land, also vanished. The pelycosaurs, which include the well-known Dimetrodon with its striking sail, had already largely disappeared by the late Permian. Yet the handful of species that lingered perished in the height of the extinction wave. The forest systems fell apart in a manner that might have been even more catastrophic than the loss of animals. Forests serve as the lungs of the land biosphere. They generate oxygen, hold soil in place, and control water cycles. During the Permian, Vast forests of seed ferns, corderites, and primitive conifers covered the land. As the climate became unstable and acid rain poured down from tainted skies, these woodlands perished on an enormous scale. The proof of this forest demise is etched into the rock layers in a troubling manner. Fungal explosions usually, fungi appear only rarely in the fossil record, breaking down dead matter without taking over habitats. But during the Permian extinction, this shifted dramatically. Fossil collections from that time display huge surges in fungal numbers, and in certain spots, fungal remains are the only ones found. Only fungal remnants appear as fossils, resulting in what researchers term fungal spikes in the rock layers. This indicates that dead vegetation piled up quicker than natural decay could process it. Whole forests' worth of plants expired, generating enormous quantities of decomposing organic material. Fungi, the sole life forms capable of breaking down wood and plant matter on a big scale, multiplied wildly. For a stretch that could have gone on for millennia, many land areas were ruled not by thriving forests, but by fungal outbreaks feasting on the remains of ruined ecosystems. The soil systems fell apart as well. Healthy Earth depends on a diverse network of creatures, bacteria, fungi, invertebrates, all cooperating to break down nutrients and sustain vegetation. Once that community crumbled, soils quickly washed away because plant roots were no longer there to anchor them. Rivers transported huge amounts of sediment to the seas, forming noticeable red layers in the rock record. These oxidized sediment deposits indicate times of intense soil loss and ecological strain. The coal gap offers additional proof of how severe the land ecosystem's breakdown was. Coal originates from plant debris that piles up in swamps and marshes. For most of our planet's past, coal layers appear fairly often in the rock sequence. Yet a break in coal creation starts right at the boundary between the Permian and Triassic periods. This period stretches for millions of years into the dawn of the Triassic. The absence of coal indicates there were no vast, swampy forests, and no plant matter could build up. Those landscapes that had generated coal over countless millennia completely disappeared. On land, the extinction pattern reveals a distinct preference. Big creatures were hit harder than their smaller counterparts, which aligns with ecological reasoning. Large animals demand greater amounts of food, more extensive habitats, and more consistent surroundings. When natural systems are falling apart and nourishment is hard to find, having a large body becomes a drawback, not a benefit. Intricate food chains fell apart, while simpler networks held on. Specialists, creatures with highly particular eating habits or living requirements, died off more often than generalists. They were able to consume many kinds of food and endure changing circumstances. Those creatures dwelling in steady, intricate environments, such as woodlands, experienced greater loss than those suited to tougher, more unpredictable settings. Yet certain bloodlines managed to carry on. Grasping the reasons behind this reveals a key insight into survival amidst devastating environmental shifts. The ones that made it through were generally small, flexible, and able to withstand difficult circumstances. They were not always the most advanced or thriving life forms of their era. Lystrosaurus, a modest-sized dicynodont protomammal, turned out to be remarkably plentiful in the wake of the mass extinction. Fossil collections from the early Triassic indicate that in certain areas, 9 out of every 10 vertebrate remains belong to Lystrosaurus. This dominance doesn't stem from Lystrosaurus being exceptionally suited or fierce. Rather, it's because barely any other life remained. In a realm where ecological roles lay vacant and systems had fallen apart, a herbivore, roughly the size of a pig, with flexible eating habits, could roam entire landmasses without rivals. The cynodonts' tiny protomammalian predators persisted in small populations. These creatures were significant as they gave rise to the first true mammals. Had the cynodonts vanished entirely, mammals, primates, and humans would never have come to be. Our presence today is due to a handful of small, rodent-like cynodonts that endured while the majority of their kin perished. The archosaurs, forerunners of dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and crocodiles, also clung to life as modest, likely semi-aquatic beings. During the Permian period, they were only minor figures in land-based habitats, filling specialized positions while protomammals ruled. The mass extinction altered this balance. Once the proto-mammals were decimated, archosaurs gradually ascended to supremacy in the Triassic and later eras. In the plant kingdom, some lineages showed greater toughness. Lycophytes, ancient spore-reproducing plants that once dominated carboniferous forests, endured in diminished quantities. Certain fern families hung on, especially those suited to disrupted or severe conditions. Early conifers fared better than seed ferns, perhaps since conifers were used to dry, demanding environments. However, survival varied greatly from place to place. The extinction did not strike all regions with the same force. Certain areas of Pangaea endured more damage, leaving a mosaic of ruin and pockets of shelter. The equatorial belt, which had been sweltering and parched even during the Permian, turned almost unlivable. The blend of intense heat, acidic precipitation, and hydrogen sulfide released from warming seas produced an environment that only the hardiest life forms could endure. Fossil records from these tropical zones reveal near-total breakdown of ecosystems. The scant fossils found are mostly Lystrosaurus, together with a few other disaster taxa organisms that could hang on but never flourish. Locations at higher latitudes, especially those that are today Antarctica and Siberia, experienced slightly reduced extinction levels. These regions began with cooler climates and stayed somewhat more livable as worldwide temperatures climbed. These areas acted as havens where certain species could wait until things got better. Yet even in these sanctuaries, natural systems were wrecked. The woodlands that once blanketed high-latitude Pangaea gave way to scrub and barren ground, and shoreline zones were hit harder than interior territories. At times, the seas turned into death traps, and their lethal reach spread onto land wherever hydrogen sulfide outbursts occurred. Fossils gathered from coastal sediments indicate several separate die-offs, implying repeated waves of extinction as oceanic anoxia came and went. The fossil evidence from this age carries a somber, eerie feel. Just beneath the extinction line in the rock layers, you discover rich, varied fossil collections. Many species, many sizes, signs of intricate ecosystems with countless interacting creatures. But once you step across that boundary, the entire diversity crumbles away. In numerous places, the rocks, right after the extinction, hold barely anything. No bones, no shells, no plant traces, only sediment and occasional fungal remnants. And when fossils do show up, they recount a tale of enduring at the very edge of what seemed possible. The creatures are tiny, typically under a meter in size. They display signs of swift growth and early breeding age adaptations for fast reproduction in shaky circumstances. Their skeletal remains frequently exhibit stress indicators, growth arrest lines that point to times of intense starvation or environmental hardship. The flora that made it through displayed comparable stress symptoms: smaller leaves, simpler leaf forms, and marks of harm from toxins and acidic rainfall. These were not flourishing systems on the mend. These were survivors clinging to existence by the barest evolutionary thread. The rock record preserves how quickly the extinction unfolded. In certain places, the total collapse of biodiversity occurred within sediment layers that span only a few thousand years, maybe even less. This is incredibly fast, in geological terms. Imagine standing at a rock face in China or South Africa. You could place one hand on Permian strata filled with fossils, then move your hand just a few centimeters up to early Triassic layers that are almost completely empty. That thin layer of rock, just a few centimeters thick, marks the downfall of an entire world. The true scale of this extinction isn't only about the number of species that vanished, it's about the richness of ecological interactions that disappeared. The Permian era boasted intricate predator-prey dynamics, elaborate food webs, and specialized roles that were filled by a wide array of life forms. In the early Triassic, almost none of that remained. Life had become ecologically simple, ruled by a handful of generalist species that filled broad but shallow niches. Scientists refer to this time as the dead zone, a stretch of millions of years when the planet's ecosystems stayed shattered. Biodiversity had sunk to its lowest point since the Cambrian explosion. The few species that hung on were merely survivors, not champions. They endured in a world that was deeply hostile to any kind of complex life. The Great Dying fully lived up to its name. This was no ordinary extinction event. It was the nearest that life on Earth has ever come to being wiped out entirely. The oceans came close to being completely lifeless, poisoned to the point where most creatures couldn't survive. The land turned almost into a desert, scorching and poisonous, making it impossible for complex ecosystems to thrive. Yet, life didn't vanish completely, it clung on by a thread. In remote pockets, in harsh environments, and in the genetic code of a few hardy species, the seeds of recovery remained. The great unknown was whether that potential would ever blossom. Could the wounds inflicted on Earth's biosphere truly mend? Or would the planet stay as a poisonous, barren wasteland, almost empty of life? The answer would not come quickly, it would take millions of years to unfold. The healing from the Permian extinction turned out to be the slowest rebound our planet has ever seen. But recovery did come, gradual and agonizing, against every obstacle. Life would eventually find a path ahead. The dying had ceased. But Earth was not yet on the mend, not at this point. It was 252 million years ago. The Permian extinction had wiped out about 95% of all species on Earth. At last, the volcanic eruptions ceased. The oceans no longer spewed hydrogen sulfide into the air. The acid rains came to a halt. Yet the world left behind was shattered in ways that went well beyond the loss of species alone. Bouncing back from a mass extinction isn't as simple as turning on a light, and it isn't even like a wound healing. It's more akin to reconstructing a whole civilization after every person who understood how it functioned has perished. The ecosystems that thrived before the disaster had vanished. Not only were the species missing, but also the connections that linked them. The predator-prey balances, the nutrient cycles, the ecological webs that had evolved over hundreds of millions of years, all of it was erased. They needed to be constructed anew, from the ground up, and that rebuilding would require 10 million years. Let that sink in, 10 million years. That's a longer stretch than the entire journey of human evolution, from our ape-like ancestors all the way to modern society. It exceeds the full timeline of human evolution, from early apes to modern civilization. That's a longer recovery period than for any other mass extinction in Earth's past. Take the dinosaur-killing event 66 million years ago. Ecosystems rebounded in under 1 million years. The late Devonian extinction, which wreaked havoc on marine species 375 million years ago, required maybe about 2 million years to recover. Yet the Permian extinction left the planet so broken, so deeply disturbed, that life struggled to gain a toehold for 10 times that duration. What made this comeback so incredibly sluggish? The clues lie in the rock layers from the early Triassic. Those rocks reveal a tale of a world that continued to threaten any surviving life. First came the heat. The Permian extinction had released massive amounts of carbon dioxide, causing global temperatures to skyrocket by 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. That alone was devastating. But the warmth persisted even after the volcanoes fell silent. Carbon dioxide remains in the air for millennia. With no thriving forests to soak it up and no healthy ocean ecosystems to bury it in seafloor sediments, the high temperatures lingered. The early Triassic was like a furnace. Equatorial areas routinely reached 50 degrees Celsius, which is 122 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to break down proteins and effectively cook flesh. No land animals could endure such conditions near the equator. The coral reefs, once rulers of the ancient seas, had vanished. The rich underwater communities of brachiopods, bryozoans, and crinoids that once carpeted the ocean floor were no more. Only narrow bands of survival remained in high-latitude zones, where the environment was brutally harsh but not entirely lifeless. Oxygen then became a serious issue. The Great Extinction had thrown ocean currents into chaos. Lacking temperature differences to stir the waters and seasonal turnover to refresh the deep with oxygen, vast stretches of the sea stayed oxygen-starved. These were lifeless regions where no breathing creature could live. And it wasn't a passing phase. The lack of oxygen lasted millions of years, swelling and shrinking as the climate shifted, yet never truly going away. To make matters worse, these dead zones repeatedly triggered new waves of hydrogen sulfide toxicity. Whenever the ocean's currents slowed down or the temperature rose by just a few degrees, the deep sea would begin generating that poisonous gas once more. The early Triassic period is famous for repeated sulfur irregularities preserved in rock layers, proof that the seas kept attacking any life that had escaped the first disaster. The carbon cycle was also fractured. Under normal circumstances, the weathering of rocks draws carbon dioxide from the air. Raindrops fall, mixing with CO2 to create a mild carbonic acid. That acid then eats away at rocks, carrying calcium and other minerals into the sea, where they are ultimately trapped in limestone. This is a self-regulating cycle that balances Earth's temperature over millions of years, yet it needs thriving ecosystems to operate effectively. Plant roots pry rocks apart, speeding up weathering, while tiny soil microbes boost chemical processes. Creatures in the ocean take those dissolved minerals to form their shells, which later drift down to the seabed, locking carbon out of reach for eons. During the early Triassic, these vital ecosystem functions had utterly broken down. Most land plants were gone, soil life was ruined, and the weathering process ground to a near halt. Ocean life had shrunk to basic, low-variety groups, so the biological carbon pump had almost completely failed. Carbon dioxide that was supposed to be removed from the air simply remained, trapping heat and blocking any chance of recovery. This left the world stuck in what researchers term a recovery stall. Living things couldn't bounce back because the environment was too extreme, yet the environment would not improve until life had recovered enough to begin repairing the shattered biogeochemical cycles. It was a cruel loop that would need countless millennia to shatter. Yet life refused to surrender. Surrender was not an option. Despite the brutal early Triassic environment, the survivors started the painstaking, unhurried work of reconstructing ecosystems from scratch. On land, a single animal reigned supreme in a way never seen before or after, the Lystrosaurus. Imagine traveling across the entire supercontinent Pangaea during the early Triassic, wherever you roamed, from modern-day Antarctica to Africa, Russia, and China. You'd come across these pig-sized plant-eaters sporting turtle-like beaks and strong claws for digging. For a few million years, Lystrosaurus made up perhaps 95% of all land-dwelling vertebrate fossils. Ponder that for a moment. Over a whole supercontinent, a single kind of creature outnumbered everything else. Imagine if the only mammals left on Earth today were wombats. Wombats as far as the eye could see, from the Arctic to Australia. Experts refer to such animals as disaster taxa species that flourish right after mass die-offs because they are exceptionally skilled at enduring awful circumstances. Lystrosaurus had hit the apocalypse jackpot thanks to a set of fortunate evolutionary traits. They could tunnel underground to avoid extreme heat and get through dry spells. Their diet consisted of the tough, basic vegetation that somehow sprouted in the ruined terrain, and they might have even consumed roots and tubers they dug up themselves. They also handled low oxygen levels far better than most other surviving creatures. They reproduced quickly and reached adulthood fast, letting their numbers swell even under tough conditions. Yet here's the catch with disaster taxa. They take over not because they are highly advanced, but because there is no rival species to challenge them. Lystrosaurus were not graceful answers to the early Triassic's problems. They were blunt force survival devices, adequate to endure when nearly everything else perished. The trouble was that as long as Lystrosaurus held sway, ecosystems could not grow more intricate. They were not generating the ecological openings that would let other species evolve and branch out. Instead, they kept evolution trapped in a survival-only state. The oceans encountered comparable limitations. Back in the Permian period, ocean communities were remarkably intricate. Hundreds of shelled species built rich ecosystems with many feeding levels, highly adapted hunters and hunted, and tangled food chains. Once the extinction struck, all that complexity fell apart. What arose during the early Triassic are what paleontologists describe as flat ecosystems, basic communities ruled by only a handful of organism types, tiny bivalves, primitive snails, and a few arthropods. Imagine thin mats spreading across the ocean floor, simple communities with barely more complexity than a layer of bacteria. These weren't vibrant ecosystems busily regenerating themselves. These places were ecological wastelands, where only a handful of tough generalists managed to survive. They clung on in this state for countless millennia. Rock layers from the early Triassic reveal these same basic communities repeating again and again. One rock stratum after another holds nearly identical fossil groups, the unmistakable mark of an ecosystem trapped in a groove, incapable of evolving greater complexity. Yet, little by little, ever so slowly, change began to stir. Some 247 million years ago, roughly 5 million years after the Great Extinction, the first hints of revival appear in the fossil record. There was no sudden burst of variety, no speedy recovery to the level of complexity seen before the catastrophe, only cautious trials. Life began to experiment, trying out fresh tactics and different ways to endure. In the seas, new hunters emerged, not the enormous apex predators of the Permian, but creatures of small to medium size. These early marine reptiles, forerunners of the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs that would later rule Mesozoic waters, were still crude and awkward next to their future kin. Yet they were stepping into roles that had been vacant since the extinction, the roles of predators. And this was vital, because predators are engineers of ecosystems. They do more than simply consume prey. They keep prey numbers in check, ensuring that no single species becomes overly dominant. Predators create pressures that push prey to develop better defenses, which in turn pushes predators to become more effective. Their hunting methods spur the evolution of ever more advanced defenses, an ongoing arms race that adds layers of complexity and boosts biodiversity. The arrival of marine predators signaled that food webs were beginning to mend, though the process was neither fast nor smooth. Meanwhile, on land, a similar transformation was underway. The Lystrosaurus monoculture was finally falling apart. New kinds of plant eaters emerged. Rhynchosaurs, lizard-like reptiles armed with strong jaws, capable of handling tough vegetation. Early archosaurs, the lineage that would one day produce dinosaurs and crocodiles, were trying out various body shapes and feeding approaches. Most notably, these archosaurs attempted something unprecedented. They began to stand upright. Most Permian and early Triassic land animals had a sprawling gait, with legs jutting out sideways from the body, much like today's lizards. That pose saves energy for slow creatures, but it restricts both speed and range. Some archosaur lines started evolving a more upright stance, with legs situated more directly beneath the body. This new posture demanded more energy to sustain, yet it made faster, longer movement possible. This opened up fresh ecological opportunities, traveling long distances to avoid harsh environments, chasing prey instead of lying in wait. It also meant they could defend bigger territories and reach resources that were spread far apart. This change in stance may appear trivial, yet it ranks among the most significant innovations of the Triassic recovery. It laid the groundwork for the later ascendancy of dinosaurs, the most triumphant lineage of land animals our planet has ever seen. But we must not rush ahead. For millions of years, those early experiments yielded no great burst of variety. The Middle Triassic, spanning roughly 247 to 237 million years ago, was a time of slow, laborious recovery. Diversity did rise, but step by step. New species emerged, yet most were short-lived. Ecosystems stayed fairly basic and were easily disrupted. Earth remained too unsettled for intricate, specialized communities to take root, and why? The underlying environmental issues had not yet been resolved. Temperatures stayed elevated. Ocean anoxia kept returning. The carbon cycle remained out of balance. The planet required more time to recover on a global scale before life could truly thrive again. The turning point arrived from an unforeseen source: plants. Throughout the early and middle Triassic, land vegetation was ruled by simple kinds: ferns, seed ferns, and horsetails. These were hardy, quick-growing plants that withstood tough conditions yet didn't build elaborate forest systems. Then, some 240 million years ago, a new group emerged: conifers. Modern conifers such as pines, spruces, and firs are well known to us. But back in the Triassic, they were evolutionary breakthroughs. They possessed several benefits over older plant groups, including the ability to grow taller and form multi-layered forest canopies. These trees used water more efficiently, so they flourished in the seasonal weather of Pangaea's heartland. Most critically, they generated enormous quantities of organic material needles branches, and dead trunks piled up on the forest floor. That decaying matter was essential for restoring soil ecosystems. As it broke down, it provided homes for fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates. Those organisms, in their turn, sped up the weathering of rocks and the cycling of nutrients. Gradually, the carbon cycle began to function correctly once more, and carbon dioxide was drawn from the atmosphere with greater efficiency. Temperatures started to fall, slowly retreating from the blistering peaks of the early Triassic. As temperatures eased, ocean currents grew stronger, and that stronger circulation carried more oxygen down into the deep. With more oxygen, anoxia withdrew, and with less anoxia came fewer outbreaks of hydrogen sulfide poisoning. Every step forward made the next step easier. The destructive cycle that had stalled recovery at last transformed into a constructive cycle of ecosystem restoration. Around 230 million years ago, in the late Triassic, Earth was at last beginning to resemble a stable, functioning world once more. Life's variety was growing quickly. Ecosystems grew more intricate, and completely fresh animal groups started climbing toward dominance. It was at this time that the dinosaurs appeared. For countless years, during the Middle Triassic, dinosaurs descended from modest archosaur forebears, were only minor and uncommon members of ecosystems ruled by other reptiles. But starting roughly 230 million years ago, they started to branch out and increase. In just 10 million years, they rose to become Earth's leading land creatures, a role they would keep for the following 165 million years. Their triumph was no fluke. Dinosaurs inherited every advancement archosaurs had been testing out during the time of recovery. An upright stance for better movement, sophisticated lungs with air sacs that boosted breathing efficiency, fast growth speeds that let them become huge in short order. They could partly control their internal warmth, which kept them stirring through changing climates. Yet beyond that, they arrived at just the perfect moment. By the late Triassic, ecosystems were robust enough to sustain sizable, varied animal populations, but no specialized established groups had taken over. Ecological chances were abundant for creatures bearing suitable traits. Dinosaurs dashed into these vacant roles and multiplied rapidly. The long-necked sauropodomorphs emerged as the earliest genuinely big plant eaters since the time preceding the Great Extinction. Theropods branched into many predatory forms, from swift little hunters to enormous top carnivores. Ornithischians started to diversify as well, trying out intricate defenses and unique ways of feeding. In just a few million years, dinosaurs transformed from trivial evolutionary side notes into the planet's most triumphant land animal group, and they would keep their dominating position longer than any other land vertebrate lineage in Earth's story. Yet, as dinosaurs began their rule, another set of survivors followed a distinctively different route. Mammals, or more precisely, the forerunners of mammals, sprang from therapsids, the same lineage that contained Lystrosaurus and other early Triassic holdouts. Back in the Permian, therapsids were amazingly varied. Some were gigantic hunters. Others were advanced plant eaters possessing intricate teeth and perhaps even fur. That diversity was shattered by the extinction event. Merely a handful of branches got through, and every one of them was tiny. The cynodonts, the group destined to produce genuine mammals, only just managed to pull through. Yet they endured, and throughout the Triassic's healing period, they started developing characteristics that would come to typify mammals. Smarter teeth for handling various food types, sharper hearing as jawbones slowly changed into the small bones of the mammalian inner ear, whiskers to feel their surroundings, likely fur for warmth, and maybe even milk production, enabling them to nourish their babies with thick milk. In many respects, these were amazing breakthroughs. The cynodonts and early mammals were more advanced than the dinosaurs, yet they stayed small creatures, no bigger than a shrew or a rat existing in the shadows of the dinosaur realm. During the subsequent 150 million years, the whole dinosaur-era mammals stayed as evolutionary high achievers, confined to minor ecological parts. Why didn't they grow bigger? Why didn't they challenge dinosaurs more directly? It appears the explanation is that dinosaurs simply filled the large animal role more effectively. Dinosaurs' erect posture, effective respiration, and speedy development offered benefits that mammals with their then current anatomy couldn't equal. Thus, mammals focused on what they could outperform dinosaurs at: staying small, being active at night, possessing keen senses and intricate habits, and devoting much attention to their offspring. They were in it for the long haul. They were building up the adaptations that would, once the next mass extinction wiped out the dinosaurs, let mammals take over the planet. But that moment was still 165 million years ahead. For the present, they were merely successful survivors of the Permian catastrophe, nothing grander. The late Triassic planet would seem bizarre to our modern eyes. The landmasses remained locked together as Pangaea, producing severe inland climates. Vast deserts covered the heart of the continent. Strong seasonal monsoon rains drenched the coastlines. There was no ice at the poles. Instead, they were blanketed with woods of conifers and seed ferns. And the ecosystems were entirely unlike anything that lived before the extinction. The Permian coral reefs had vanished, replaced by reefs constructed by entirely distinct creatures. Scleractinian corals, the ones that form present-day coral reefs, came about during the Middle Triassic. They were not connected to Permian corals. These corals separately developed the capacity to create calcium carbonate skeletons and assemble reef formations. Evolution hit on a comparable answer to the identical ecological challenge, yet it had to devise reef construction all over again. On land, forests were mainly composed of conifers and other seed-bearing plants. The ancient coal swamp forests from the Carboniferous and Permian periods, filled with towering club mosses and horsetails, had vanished forever. Those lush, wet woodlands were never to be seen again. In their place came drier forests, better suited to fire, which gave rise to new kinds of habitats and nurtured different species of animals. Under the waves, the entire ecological order was reshaped from the ground up. During the recovery in the Triassic, the foundations of today's marine food chains, open water hunters, and intricate plankton societies started to take form. Before this, the oceans had revolved around life on the seafloor creatures dwelling in and upon the sediment. The Great Dying had eliminated the majority of these life forms, leaving the open water ready for fresh bloodlines to move in. This was more than a simple recovery. It was a complete reinvention. The blow was so devastating that evolution had no choice but to craft something entirely new, rather than merely patching up what had been destroyed. Whole new ecosystems emerged, each with its own structure, its own ruling groups, and its own web of ecological ties. And here is the truly deep insight. This blueprint of restructuring became the mold for the biodiversity we know today. The key players that rule our present-day ecosystems, dinosaurs, mammals, corals, as we know them, reef fish, and flowering plants, most of these first showed up either during the Triassic recovery or not long after. They were born from the extinction and the long shadow it cast. If the Permian disaster had never happened, and if those 10 million years of trial and error ecosystem repair had not taken place, our world today would be utterly unrecognizable. Around 220 million years ago, about 32 million years after the extinction, the planet at last found its balance. Once again, ecosystems were intricate and full of variety. The carbon cycle was running smoothly once more. The oceans had regained their proper oxygen content. Worldwide temperatures had cooled down, even if they were still a bit higher than what the Permian period had known. Life had passed its most severe trial. It had weathered 10 million slow years of recovery, trying out fresh shapes and novel approaches until it stumbled upon winning combinations. The world that came out of this was odd and unprecedented, yet it was alive, pulsing with energy, rich in variety, unstoppably full of life. The era of the dinosaurs had dawned, and lurking in the background, tiny, furry beings were biding their time. The extinction had remade everything, and those transformations would resonate across vast stretches of time, guiding the course of life on our planet for the next 250 million years. Now comes the unsettling reality. When we study the events of 252 million years ago and truly inspect the forces that came close to wiping out complex life, we cannot overlook the similarities to our own time. That Permian extinction was not brought on by an asteroid. No space rock struck the Earth. No sudden visitor from the heavens. Instead, it was the work of volcanoes pouring huge quantities of greenhouse gases into the air, century after century. Does this ring a bell? The Siberian Traps belched out somewhere from 3 to 15 trillion tons of carbon dioxide. That is a colossal figure, disastrous, no matter how you look at it. Yet here is something that might give you pause. Right now, humanity pumps out roughly 37 billion tons of CO2 each year. We are heading toward a total carbon release similar to the entire Siberian Traps event. Only we are accomplishing this in just a few centuries, not millennia. Let that sink in for a moment. A catastrophe that almost made the Earth barren took perhaps 200,000 years to release its carbon. We are emitting a comparable amount in under 500 years. The speed of transformation is the critical factor, and we are altering the planet about 100 times more rapidly than the disaster that triggered the most severe mass extinction ever. Still, bare figures only reveal a fraction of the tale. The underlying processes are important. The chain reactions, the domino effects, they matter too. And at this point, the Permian extinction stops feeling like distant history and starts resembling a handbook for global catastrophe, one we are diligently following, stage by stage. Let us begin with the acidification of the oceans. As the Siberian Traps spewed CO2, a great deal of it dissolved into the seas, just as happens today. The chemical reaction is straightforward and inescapable. Carbon dioxide plus water yields carbonic acid, lowering the pH and making the ocean more acidic. During the Permian, this process unfolded over tens of thousands of years. Sea creatures, particularly those that construct shells and skeletons out of calcium carbonate, found it increasingly difficult to hold their form. Coral reefs began to melt away, and animals with shells could no longer fashion their armored homes. The very foundation of the ocean's food chain disintegrated, and in our own time, we are watching this identical process speed up. Even before our time, the ocean's pH has fallen by 0.1 units. At first glance, that seems small, yet because pH is logarithmic, that drop means a 30% rise in acidity. Across the globe, coral reefs are undergoing widespread bleaching. Along the Pacific coast, shellfish hatcheries are collapsing as lava oysters struggle to build shells in waters that grow more acidic each year. The basic chemistry hasn't shifted for 252 million years. Carbon dioxide and water still produce carbonic acid. We are repeating the Siberian Traps experiment, only at a much faster pace. And then the warming itself. During the Permian extinction, worldwide temperatures climbed by 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. Throughout this era, certain areas faced even more severe rises. The equatorial seas, which were already warm, became almost lifeless, with surface waters exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. The vast majority of sea creatures cannot endure such heat. Their proteins simply break down. Their cellular functions fail. The tropics turned into zones of death. We haven't reached that point yet. Nowhere near it. At present, warming stands at about 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial figures. However, we are heading the same way. Crucially, our pace is quicker. The warming of the Permian extinction unfolded over tens of millennia. We have reached today's warming level in roughly 150 years. If we stay on this path, we could witness 3 to 4 degrees of warming by 2100, only 75 years away. That is not yet a Permian-scale catastrophe, yet it moves toward it at a speed that makes the Permian warming seem slow. The truly frightening aspect is the tipping points. The Permian extinction was not solely due to volcanic CO2. That merely sparked the event. What truly devastated the planet was the chain reaction of feedback loops that ensued. Carbon dioxide set off warming. That warming freed methane from seafloor reservoirs. Methane then intensified the warming, leading to the release of still more methane. This destabilized additional carbon stores, killed off more plant life, freed up more carbon, and drove warming further. You can see the pattern. Once the cascade began, it became self-feeding. The planet no longer required the Siberian Traps. It produced its own heat through intertwined feedback loops that sustained one another for hundreds of thousands of years. We are now facing the same critical thresholds. In the Arctic, methane stores within permafrost are starting to become unstable. With rising temperatures, the frozen soil that has trapped methane for millennia is now thawing. Bear in mind, Methane is 80 times more effective than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas over a 2-decade span. At first, these releases remain relatively minor. Yet this is precisely how the Permian cascade started. Small emissions that cause more warming, which then cause larger emissions, which in turn cause even more warming. The Arctic is heating up at twice the rate of the rest of the world. Permafrost that has remained frozen for thousands of years is becoming swamps and lakes. Methane bubbles are rising from Arctic seas. We have not entered runaway warming, but the process is beginning to activate. It is like seeing a car begin to slide on ice in slow motion. You anticipate the collision, but it hasn't happened yet. Ocean currents offer another similarity. In the Permian extinction, warming disturbed the thermohaline circulation, the vast conveyor belt that transports water and heat worldwide. When surface water gets too warm or too fresh, it ceases to sink. The circulation either slows down or halts completely. Without this churning, the deep sea becomes still and anoxic. Oxygen levels drop sharply. Poisonous hydrogen sulfide builds up. The seas take on a purple hue from bacterial blooms and become lethal to most complex organisms. Today, we observe evidence that key ocean currents are growing weaker. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which comprises the Gulf Stream, has decelerated by roughly 15% since the mid-20th century. This is the current that makes Europe livable and tempers climate throughout the Northern Hemisphere. Should this system weaken dramatically or come to a halt, the aftermath would be devastating. Northern Europe would face intense cooling, while the rest of the planet continues to warm. Our weather patterns would become highly unstable. The ocean's ecosystems would completely fall apart. We would essentially be replaying another aspect of the Permian cascade. Yet at this point, the tale becomes more refined and, in some respects, offers a glimmer of hope. The Permian extinction also imparts lessons on resilience and the will to survive. Not all species were wiped out. Not every ecosystem underwent total collapse. The creatures that endured reveal crucial insights about which traits enable life to carry on through disaster. A compact body size was beneficial. Smaller creatures require fewer resources, less space, and less energy to get by. These smaller animals can survive in harsh, borderline habitats. They can seek shelter in safe refuges. They can weather calamities that would cause larger species to starve. In the time of the Permian extinction, the megafauna were the first to perish. The mighty predators, the massive herbivores, the dominant creatures that had presided over their environments for eons. They simply demanded too many resources that had vanished. However, petite animals, rodent-like cynodonts, small reptiles, and unassuming amphibians, some of these managed to survive. Dietary adaptability proved helpful. Specialists did not survive. If your evolution had steered you toward a single food source, you faced extinction. Consume a single type of plant or prey exclusively, and when that food source vanished, you were finished. Yet generalists, animals capable of eating many different things, alternating between plants and meat, scavenging as needed, had plenty of choices. As the old ecosystems crumbled, they could adapt and shift to whatever sustenance was left. Organisms living in fresh water fared better than those in the ocean. Rivers and lakes, sustained by rain and runoff, stayed relatively stable compared to the seas. While the oceans turned acidic and poisonous, essentially death traps, certain freshwater habitats continued to sustain life. Fish, amphibians, and freshwater invertebrates suffered heavy losses, yet they were not entirely annihilated. The extinction level in freshwater environments was about 50% still horrible, but far less than the 90 to 95% catastrophe in the oceans. Geographic distribution played a crucial role. Species spanning vast territories, many continents, and varied climates stood a better chance compared to endemics confined to tiny areas. If a region became unlivable, a widely distributed species could endure elsewhere. Local groups might be wiped out, yet somewhere, somehow, a remnant population could continue. These patterns of survival are more than mere historical oddities. They constitute valuable data that points to which modern species are most susceptible to swift shifts in the environment. Large animals with narrow diets constrained to limited areas, these are the ones facing the greatest danger. And when we examine the current conservation status, that's precisely what we observe. Pandas consume nearly only bamboo, confined to narrow mountain ranges. Polar bears, highly vulnerable, have evolved to hunt seals on Arctic sea ice that is melting away quickly. Orangutans, also vulnerable, rely on particular rainforest environments in their diminishing habitats. Both species are now critically threatened. In contrast, species that match the Parian survivor template are faring reasonably well. Rats, with small bodies and omnivorous diets, are found across the globe. They flourish in environments modified by humans. Coyotes, highly adaptive hunters, can modify what they eat and how they behave to suit almost any circumstance. Their territory is spreading throughout North America. Pigeons, meanwhile, can consume almost any food and thrive wherever people reside. These species are more successful today than at any previous time. The Parian extinction provides us with clear insight into which species we should be most concerned about, and the message is unmistakable. Specialists face difficulty, endemics are at risk, and large creatures reliant on particular habitats are in the most peril. These are the animals requiring urgent conservation focus, as they are most likely to share the fate of their Parian predecessors. However, comprehending the problem is not the same as knowing how to fix it. It is here that the Parian extinction delivers its most sobering lesson. Recovery requires an inconceivably long span. Even after the extinctions ended, even after carbon dioxide concentrations started to decrease, temperatures began to even out, and after the immediate emergency had faded, Earth stayed a hollowed-out planet for countless millennia. Coral reefs took 10 million years to reappear. Elaborate ocean ecosystems required 5 million years to rebuild. For a minimum of 4 million years, life on land stayed at a low ebb. It required an additional 30 million years after that for ecosystems to recover the richness and variety they'd once enjoyed before the Great Dying. This isn't simply deep time, it's geological forever. Spans so immense they slip beyond our human grasp. Imagine this. All of human civilization, from the earliest farming villages to the modern day, covers about 10,000 years. Meanwhile, the gap between the dinosaurs' disappearance and now is 66 million years, which is actually longer than the planet needed to bounce back from the Permian extinction. Should a catastrophe of Permian proportions strike our world today, life would ultimately rebound. New forms would arise, ecosystems would mend themselves, and the planet would heal. Yet we wouldn't be around to witness it. Humanity itself would not endure such an event. And even if scattered groups of humans somehow managed to survive the initial disaster, they'd spend their whole lives, perhaps hundreds of millennia, on a stripped-down, simpler, poorer world. Any far-off descendants might one day inherit a restored Earth, but only after periods so vast that our entire history seems like a fleeting spark. Here lies the deepest message of the Permian extinction. Earth will be okay. Life goes on, evolution marches forward, and our planet has weathered far worse than anything we could throw at it. Yet, the world that emerges might be one we wouldn't recognize, or one we could never call home. Recovery unfolds across geological eons that feel nearly endless to us. We never witness a return to normal, because normal only reappears millions of years after we've vanished. So how do we know any of this? How can researchers examine stones from 252 million years ago? And how can they piece together a chain of environmental breakdowns, critical thresholds, and recovery schedules that stretch across millions of years? The proof is literally etched into rock. Deciphering it calls for merging several fields of study, many separate threads of inquiry, all converging on one dreadful narrative. Let's begin with the rocks themselves. Strata deposited during the Permian extinction bear unique marks. At the extinction horizon, abrupt shifts in rock makeup become visible. Limestone beds built from the shells and skeletons of sea creatures either vanish or grow noticeably thinner. The sea had stopped making calcium carbonate because too few creatures were constructing shells, and variations in oxygen isotopes point to temperature changes. The balance between oxygen, 1,6, and oxygen 18 inches fossil shells tells us about ocean temperatures from millions of years ago. The Permian boundary layers reveal intense warming, sometimes over 10 degrees in what seems like geologically fast timescales. Carbon isotopes narrate the tale of the atmosphere, The ratio of carbon, 1,2 to carbon, 1,3, changes sharply at the boundary, signaling huge amounts of organic carbon, which could be from volcanic outgassing or methane released by biological processes. The exact pattern of these shifts allows researchers to tell apart various carbon sources and grasp the order of events. Sulfur isotopes uncover the ocean's chemistry. During anoxic intervals, when oxygen in seawater falls, bacteria handle sulfur in a different way. The isotope signatures locked in rock indicate when and where oceans lost their oxygen. Permian boundary strata reveal extensive anoxia that persisted for hundreds of millennia. And then we have the fossils, or, more tellingly, their absence. Paleontologists refer to this as the Permian Gap. Strata lying immediately beneath the extinction horizon are crowded with fossils, hundreds of species, varied ecosystems, life in abundance. Then, abruptly, within a stratum, often only a few centimeters thick, most vanish. The beds directly above hold far fewer species, perhaps only 10% of those that once lived. And many of the survivors exhibit what paleontologists term the Lilliput effect, temporary dwarfing, with animals shrinking drastically. This happened during the crisis period, another indicator of environmental strain. The fossil record reveals not only which species perished, but also the order in which extinction struck. First came the marine invertebrates, then land vertebrates, followed by insects, a group that rarely suffers mass die-offs. This pattern suggests a domino effect, with ecosystems failing one after another as the catastrophe expanded. Paleontologists also examine preserved pollen and spores. These tiny structures are superbly preserved and recount the history of land plant life. At the Permian boundary, pollen diversity plummets. Rich, multi-species forests yield to sparse communities made up of only a few hardy, fast-colonizing plants. This is the plant world's counterpart to a weedy field taking over an ancient forest, and this state lingers for millions of years in the geological record. Some of the most striking proof comes from biomarkers, molecular fossils that survive in rock, even when all visible fossils have vanished. Researchers can detect specific compounds made by certain bacteria, like the purple sulfur bacteria, which signal toxic anoxic conditions. These biomarkers surge dramatically in rocks from the extinction interval, offering direct physical proof of the poisonous ocean environment. But here's what makes this research so fascinating. Independent teams, each examining distinct rock layers on separate continents with their own analytical techniques, all converge on identical findings. The timelines align perfectly. These geochemical markers all point in the same direction. The fossils confirm the same tale. The principles of physics and chemistry fit together seamlessly. This is not guesswork. It is a careful reconstruction built on many separate sources of proof that support each other. Naturally, not all scientists agree on every nuance. Exactly how much the temperature rose and how quickly varied. The best estimates suggest an increase of 8 to 12 degrees Celsius over periods spanning 10,000 to 100,000 years. Was the primary boost from methane bubbling out of ocean sediments? Or did carbon from burning coal seams contribute more? Was it ocean acidification or oxygen depletion that wiped out more sea creatures? The arguments go on because new clues keep surfacing. Improved analytical methods allow scientists to extract fresh insights from ancient rocks. New fossil finds continue to close gaps in our knowledge. In just the last 10 years, researchers have identified feedback loops we hadn't known about before and narrowed down the timing of the extinction. They also realized that the recovery phase lasted even longer and was far more intricate than previously believed. Yet, the central storyline remains unchanged. Enormous volcanic eruptions set off a chain of environmental disasters that destroyed most life on Earth and left the planet barren for ages. That part is not up for debate. The specifics are being honed, but the essential narrative is firm, backed by many years of study and countless scientific papers. And that narrative should shape how we view our own circumstances today. Because here we stand, 252 million years later, running a very similar experiment. We are pumping out carbon at rates never seen before. We are making the oceans more acidic, setting off feedback loops, and heading toward thresholds. The processes haven't changed. The chemistry remains the same, and the physics of planetary systems still operates exactly as it did back in the Permian. There is one edge we possess that our Permian ancestors lacked. We grasp what is going on, and we can decipher the warnings inscribed in ancient rock layers. We can foresee where this road leads, because we have discovered the markers throughout geological history. The Permian extinction demonstrates precisely what occurs when you saturate the atmosphere with greenhouse gases faster than Earth's natural systems can adjust. It teaches us about tipping points and chain reactions, and shows the unimaginably long recovery times. Most of all, it shows that complex life on our planet is more delicate than we prefer to admit. Yes, life endured, and yes, Earth bounced back, but it took millions of years. The species that thrived before the disaster, the ones that had dominated their environments for ages, never returned. They were supplanted by entirely new groups that evolved in the aftermath. If we keep going as we are, human civilization won't last to see that recovery. Neither will most large animals, most specialized creatures, most of the biodiversity we consider typical. Earth will ultimately recover, but it will do so without us, slowly, over time spans that make human history seem insignificant. That is the echo we hear from 252 million years ago, a caution carried across deep time, a signal from a planet that nearly perished, telling us that the forces behind mass extinction are universal. That atmospheric carbon does not care whether it comes from volcanoes or from burning fossil fuels. That feedback loops, once activated, do not stop simply because the initial trigger ends. That thresholds, once crossed, lead to places from which you cannot return on any timeline that matters to human society. The rocks remember, the fossils remember, the chemical signatures remember, and they are all telling us the same message. We are not as disconnected from the Permian extinction as we might wish. We are reflections of that ancient disaster. Possibly the first species in Earth's history able to grasp the warnings from deep time and deliberately choose a different course. The question is whether we will heed those echoes or become one ourselves. And so here we are, 252 million years after the night the Earth stopped breathing. After the Siberian Traps split open and reshaped the planet, after the seas turned poisonous and the air became toxic, after 96% of marine life and 70% of land vertebrates vanished into the fossil record, after every possible calamity struck at once, catastrophically, for hundreds of thousands of years, and yet here you are, listening to this. Earth remains, bustling with life. The oceans teem with fish. The forests are filled with birds. The land is blanketed with mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. All of them are descendants of that tiny handful of survivors who made it through the worst extinction event in the planet's history. That is the first lesson from deep time. Life is remarkably fragile. A few volcanic fissures in Siberia, some unfortunate chemistry, and nearly everything dies. The vast web of intricate life that evolved across hundreds of millions of years can vanish in a geological moment. The Permian realm, home to giant amphibians, early mammal-like predators, and strange sail-backed beings, was wiped out completely, replaced by something new. But there's another insight here, one that may bring you comfort as you rest. Yet life is remarkably resilient. It never surrenders. It always discovers a path forward. Even when 96% of species disappear, the surviving 4% endures. They persist in thermal pools, deep-sea hydrothermal vents, and high-altitude sanctuaries. They endure through the poisonous eras, and once the environment calms, they burst forth into a stunning variety of forms. The Triassic world that rose from the Permian extinction bore little resemblance to its predecessor. The animals that took over the planet were not the former rulers of the previous age. Instead, they were the oddballs, the outliers, those that had barely survived in small pockets while the great beasts reigned. Among these successors were small, modest reptiles that narrowly escaped the great extinction. Over a few million years, they evolved into the most dominant vertebrates ever known, the dinosaurs. Their very existence depended on that Permian disaster. The calamity that wiped out most life opened the door for their ascent. This is the rhythm of deep time. Disasters that appear utterly conclusive to humans are merely shifts over geological epochs. Our planet has endured far more than we can conceive and has emerged transformed, yet still vibrant, always vibrant. Let that thought accompany you into sleep. The oxygen you inhale at this moment, the air that expands your chest with each breath, is the result of billions of years of biological craftsmanship. Cyanobacteria first produced oxygen. Plants then fine-tuned and sustained the atmosphere. Animals adapted to utilize it effectively. Even the devastating Permian extinction was merely a single episode in that unfolding narrative. Earth has been locked in ice from one pole to the other. It has been scorched beneath poisonous skies as volcanoes reshaped entire landmasses. It has been struck by asteroids that dwarf the Siberian Traps in violence. Yet throughout all this, life has endured, not unchanged. For evolution never reverses course. The Permian era has vanished permanently. Yet life itself, that curious chemical process born in a primordial sea vent or a tidal pool, carries on. We are now woven into that tale. Today's humans, who nearly vanished themselves only 900,000 years ago, now recount tales of extinctions that occurred 252 million years ago. That is an astonishing vantage point. No other creature in Earth's history has been able to gaze across geologic ages and comprehend its role in the enduring saga of life. It is a humbling thought, isn't it? All that appears eternal is fleeting over geologic spans. Mountains wear down, seas shift, continents crash together and tear apart. Species emerge and vanish, giving way to new ones. Our planet holds no special regard for any single species. It continues to rotate, to transform, to serve as a platform for whatever organisms can adjust to the present circumstances. Yet there is a strange comfort in this. The planet has weathered far more severe trials than any we face now. It will remain long after humanity has faded away, and it will likely harbor entirely new life forms, beings as foreign to us as we would seem to those Permian amphibians. That is the essence of deep time. All things pass, all things transform, all things continue in novel shapes. So as you shut your eyes this evening, allow yourself to drift back across those 252 million years. Envision the Siberian volcanoes spewing forth. Recall the poisonous seas and the desperate survivors. Reflect on the slow healing, the gradual restoration of Earth's ecosystems that required millions of years to recover. Keep in mind that you belong to a lineage that overcame its own crisis, bearing the resilience of life across endless disasters. As you prepare to sleep, if this expedition through deep time pleased you, consider giving this video a like. That helps others discover these tales of our planet's bygone eras. Leave a comment sharing your current location and which corner of today's world you inhabit while contemplating the ancient one. Also subscribe if you'd like further journeys into prehistoric enigmas, more accounts of the times when everything shifted. There are additional mass extinctions awaiting exploration. The asteroid impact that wiped out the dinosaurs. The late Devonian collapse that almost terminated complex life before it fully emerged. The enigmatic Ordovician extinction, which we are still deciphering. Each event narrates catastrophe and endurance, destruction and rebirth, conclusions that doubled as commencements. But those are tales for another evening. For now, rest peacefully. Take a soft, deep breath. Each inhalation links you to billions of years of Earth's story. You exist at the tip of a line of survival that reaches all the way back through the Permian extinction, and even further back to the earliest signs of life on a youthful Earth. Our planet paused its breath once, 252 million years in the past, yet it resumed. Life always finds a way to begin anew. This is the wisdom we take from ancient epics. Let this reflection accompany you into your slumber this evening. Pleasant dreams. From the depths of time, and never forget, you are a chapter in the most extended tale ever told.